Yes. Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this. Okay. Wait, it says. Welcome, everyone, to the Stimson Center. It is my pleasure to invite you to what I hope will be a really thorough and interesting discussion of the crisis in Gaza and in Israel and the West Bank. As it happens, today is the 76th anniversary of UN Resolution 181, which was supposed to partition the British Mandate of Palestine into Jewish and Palestinian states. Now, as we all know, a Jewish state came into being, but a Palestinian state never has. And much of the 22% of historic Palestine that was supposed to go to this Palestinian state has been occupied by settlements in the West Bank or currently lies in ruins in the Gaza Strip. Now, the purpose of today's webinar is not to relitigate the past, but to discuss where this historic conflict stands, its implications for the region and US policy, and what more can be done to prevent atrocities like those that occurred on October 7th from occurring, and also try to keep the already terrible death toll in Gaza from rising to even more horrific levels. So we've assembled a very fine panel of experts to talk about these issues. And we're going to start with Meirav Zonsain, an Israeli-American journalist who is the senior Israel analyst with the International Crisis Group. Then we'll turn to Halil Jashan, a Palestinian-American political analyst and commentator who is the executive director of the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Next to Colin Meisel, a non-resident fellow here at Stimson, who is also associate director of geopolitical analysis at the University of Denver's Korbel School. Then we'll turn to an old friend, Randa Slim, who directs the Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues program at the Middle East Institute. And last, but most definitely not least, another old friend, Ali Vaez, who is senior advisor to the president and project director for Iran at the International Crisis Group. So we're going to start with Meirav. The Israeli analyst Yossi Alfer on Monday said, quote, Israel is on the right track, yet has a long way to go toward decisive victory, unquote. So I ask you, where do things stand in terms of Israeli strategy and opinion? Is there support for resuming the war after more hostages are released? Is there confidence that US and more broadly Western support will continue given the unprecedented death toll in Gaza? What is the state of play right now in Israel?
Thanks, Barbara. Hi, everybody. I'm not really sure what Yossi Alfer was referring to because there really is no clear strategy or clear victory narrative in this war. We're now 53 days into it. On the 5th day of a ceasefire in which we've seen hostage release. And I mean, you asked several questions, so if I don't address them all, let me know and I'll address them. But I think it's important to understand that the mood in Israel, first of all, the shattering of the sense of security on October 7th remains, and the sense of mourning remains. And I think Israelis are primarily consumed with that. And obviously, they're not thinking about the continuation of this war. The first weeks of the war, people were completely paralyzed as far as education system, and they were just going to funerals, and it was a complete disarray. People are starting now, I think, to collect themselves more, but they feel no trust in this government, and that was even before October 7th. And so the visceral distrust and resentment towards this government is now coming out in the hostage release scenario, which the families of the hostages have pushed for this. And they have succeeded, actually, in making this a priority in this war. And I think the the political leadership must have understood that without a clear victory narrative and without clear achievements up until now, this is how they have to go. They have to bring back these people. And the Israeli public feels like the failure of the government and the IDF on October 7th means that the obligation in principle and in practice of the Israeli government is to bring them all home at whatever cost, even if that means releasing all Palestinian prisoners. And that has been a demand by some of the families of the hostages. And there's also a precedent with the Gilad Shalit deal when he was released. So it's not something that's unheard of. And then you have a far-right government that is threatening to, if the war is stopped or if we release all these prisoners, we're not going to stay in the coalition. So what you really have is just a complete disarray, I think, in the cabinet, in the war cabinet, and in the government about what exactly they're going to do. Because I think at this point, they're going to be forced to choose between saving the rest of the hostages, primarily the soldiers, if it goes according to plan and they extend this up until all the civilians are coming out. They're going to have to make a decision to stop the war or to continue with the war and lose some of these soldiers. And then, of course, the continuation of this war, which would be a catastrophe for the people of Gaza. It's already a catastrophe, would not necessarily even bring us the achievement that Israel promises, right? Which would be the eradication of Hamas, a military objective that I think many people agree, even if you're able to incapacitate them, that's not something that's going to necessarily mean Hamas is out of the picture, not to mention what other entities and political ideas could come out, after the day after, or whatever that would be. So I think, we're in a very, very difficult and fragile position. And Israelis really are not concerned right now with the death toll in Gaza or the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. They're concerned with bringing home all of the hostages, and they then want to see Hamas deposed. They want to see Hamas toppled. They don't really understand how that's going to happen, how long it's going to take. And Israel has continued throughout this truce ceasefire now to say that it will continue with combat. And nobody really understands what that's going to look like or how severe it will be for both sides.
All right. I should add, by the way, that those who are watching online should please put questions into the Q&A box on your Zoom screen, and we will leave ample time to get to your questions after all our speakers have spoken. I'm going to go to Halil next. The world has not seen carnage like this in a very long time. 1,200 Israelis dead, most of them civilian, and of course we're up to, I think, 15,000 are the reports coming out of Gaza. New York Times reported recently that more women and children have been killed in Gaza in less than 2 months than the 7,700 civilians killed by the US and allied forces in the first year of the Iraq War, and the more than 12,000 killed by the United States and its allies in Afghanistan during nearly 20 years of war. Even the first Palestinian Intifada, the toll was less than 1,500, and that was for a number of years, and 175 Israelis. That was in the first Intifada. But the U.S. government, well, we'll talk about the U.S. government position. I mean, the support seems to be holding, although I noticed that an American senior official is going to Israel almost every day, it seems, to talk to the Israelis behind the scenes and perhaps try to exert some influence. So tell me first, how do you see the situation in Gaza? It's hard to describe, I know. And also, if you would, add a few words about the very, very tense and difficult situation in the West Bank. And you are muted, so unmute yourself.
Thank you, Barbara. Appreciate your invitation to be part of this distinguished panel. And thank you to the Stimson Center for bringing us together to discuss this very, very important development in a very important, strategically important region for U.S. national interest. First, let me begin with a little bit of an introductory remark, if you don't mind. Just take a minute to say that the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict and its core, the Palestine question, did not start on October 7, 2023, as we all know. The surprise attack that was waged by Hamas on that Saturday morning, early in the morning, and the tragic events that followed over the past 54 days since were the culmination rather than the beginning of a protracted conflict that includes, which is very important for the Gaza population, which includes essentially an ongoing 75-year-old Nakba, characterized for these people as collective displacement, dispossession, and dispersion. And mind you, just a reminder, 70% of the population of Gaza are refugees and their descendants from 1948. Of course, add to that 56-year-old occupation since 1967 and 17-year-old blockade of Gaza. So there is a context. It's important to see today's crisis and today's war in that context, because protracted conflicts, ladies and gentlemen, if left unresolved, I think tend to resemble or develop into volcanoes. They are destined to explode, as we have seen on October 7, when you least expect it. And that's essentially the surprise we're all continue to suffer from. In terms of the current situation, as you just referred, it's been really a devastating war. We've seen a lot of wars. This is probably at least number 15 since 1948 in my lifetime between Palestinians and Israelis. It's not necessarily the most dramatic, or let's say the most vicious of all these wars, most violent, yet I have a feeling that it's emerging to be one of the most important. You know, people keep talking, Middle East experts, about 67, and it took us like 30, 40 years to clean up after 67. I have a feeling, it's a hunch, that this one, as small as it is, we're not talking about 2 million soldiers fighting here. We're talking about a minimum of maybe 1,000 to 2,000 Hamas fighters that started the fight on October 7, but the impact is going to be probably as large, if not larger, than 1967. If we are to survive this group or any other group over the next 10, 15 years, I think we're going to be talking about the political fallout and the political implications of this. It's a much larger than life, I think, event because of its surprise, because of its nature, because of its timing, and because of the reaction to it. You're right, more than 15,000. Some people even put the numbers at closer to 20,000, which means to me, when you say 15,000, let's take the minimal number. That is 1 out of 150 Gazans killed. 1 out of 150 Gazans killed thus far. 92% of them are civilians, because as you know, the Israeli army initially said only 1,000 Hamas fighters participated in this and have been killed. That's about 8% of the victims. Now they up the number, maybe 2 to 3, but even if it's 2,000, we're talking about essentially, 8% of the victims are Hamas. The rest are essentially civilian. 44% are children, 20% are women, about 40,000 injured thus far. But most importantly, referring back to the Nakba and the significance of the Nakba to Gaza refugee population, 1.7 displaced people.
1.7 billion, yeah.
74% of the population, ladies and gentlemen, 74. Just imagine 74% of the US population being asked to move to 4 or 5 southern states in order to facilitate an invasion from the north. In addition, of course, the magnitude of the destruction. We're talking about almost 60,000 housing units, homes, having been completely destroyed. We're talking about 165, 3 times that amount, partially destroyed and probably unlivable. I mean, you've seen people living in the rubble, essentially. You're talking about 266 damaged schools. You're talking about 22 out of 32 or 36 damaged and dysfunctional hospitals in the Strip. So when I look, for example, at the Bank of Israel report today showing that an estimated $51 billion this war has cost Israel. 51 billion, 200 billion shekels. And experts tell me at the bank that the number could become $200 billion rather than shekels, because you remember it's almost 4 shekels to the dollar. And this is the cost to Israel. Imagine the cost to Gaza. What is it going to take, and where is that money going to come from if we are to restore basic, normal, decent human life to Gaza? So that's essentially the situation. It's dismal enough, even for the administration, which hasn't shown enough, frankly, sensitivity to what's happening to the civilians in Gaza. Yesterday, we had to send, the White House had to send 54,000 pounds, 1/3 of a shipment of humanitarian aid through Egypt, to which Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, said much more is needed.
Yeah. Before I let you go, just a word on the tensions in the West Bank. We've seen, over 200 people killed, Palestinians killed on the West Bank since October 7th, yes?
Yes, there is another use for the old number that you and I have memorized many years ago, Barbara, 242. And there it comes back to hunt us. 242 Palestinians already killed in the West Bank. Several thousand have been arrested, and the situation is very dismal. About, I would say, 3,000 to 5,000 Palestinians have been arrested since the beginning of this war. So the number has increased from 5,200 prisoners in Israel. So they have a lot to exchange, I guess,
Yes.
if they are to pursue that. But this week, I mean, the tragic tragedy of this is 150 Palestinian prisoners have thus far been exchanged. Did you know that 133 new prisoners have been taken this week?
Oh,
I mean,
dear.
this is a damn revolving door. It's an endless revolving door. And I don't know when it is going to stop. And the most fascinating to me is the interviews, totally different. The interviews with the Israeli released hostages and the interviews with the Palestinian released prisoners, reporting essentially not only torture, starvation, denial of medicine, not enough clothes for the winter season that just began, there, lack of water, lack of electricity, etc., lack of hygiene supplies, but more importantly, beatings on the way to the exchange with the Red Cross. This is just unbelievable.
Yeah, let me stop you there and go to what I think is also an underreported aspect of this whole conflict. And Colin, I read an excellent piece that you did for Stimson Center on the indirect costs of wars. And if you could just talk a little bit about, even if somehow this ceasefire or pause holds, and we do not see more large death tolls from the fighting in Gaza, what are we likely to see in terms of the short-term, mid-term, longer-term effects on the population?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Barbara, and thanks for highlighting that piece that I wrote. So the shadow of this conflict is likely to be long, and exactly, besides the death toll that's been reported, there are many others that are likely dying and will continue to die even if the fighting stops. So to review what we know, the total death toll of more than 15,000 people, it's tallied from the number of dead who arrive at Gaza hospitals, plus the number of wounded individuals who die after arrival. Sadly, though, this number doesn't appear to account for many indirect conflict attributable deaths. So aside from dying in airstrikes and the like, many other people are dying due to a lack of services and supplies that they otherwise would have had in the absence of conflict. So, for example, as of early last week, there were 8 newborns at Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City that died due to a lack of clean water and medicine. Right? They weren't killed in an airstrike. They didn't receive the services they need. Khalil's gone over many of the facts, but somewhere close to 3/4 of Gazans have been made homeless since October 7th. Many are sleeping outside in the rain in the winter. Prior to the recent pause in fighting, only 1/10 of the food aid that the UN estimated Gaza needed was actually being delivered to Gazans. And even since aid has rushed into Gaza over the past few days, the price of flour is up by more than half. The price of water has more than doubled since September. Meanwhile, cases of diarrhea for children under the age of 5 are up by nearly 20-fold relative to recent years' monthly averages. As well as other diseases that have spread. So we're talking about several tens of thousands of young children who are severely ill because of this conflict, and that will have lifelong impacts. The condition of Gaza, it's similar in some ways to that of Yemen during the height of its recent conflict. In that conflict, there were more people died from indirect but conflict attributable deaths, so treatable diseases and things, than from bombs and bullets. In Yemen, roughly 60% of the roughly 380,000 dead, they died as a result of indirect conflict attributable causes. So in other words, if you ignore indirect deaths, you're likely to miss probably half the deaths that are happening from this conflict. So we may be underestimating the number by half. Like Gaza today, where at least 40% of those in the war who've been killed have been children. Many of the dead in Yemen were children as well. So in 2021, my colleagues estimated that a child under the age of 5 died every 9 minutes in Yemen because of the conflict. So, I mean, imagine that. If the fighting were not paused in Israel or in Gaza today, then the current average hourly death rate since the start of the war, roughly 7 Gazan children would have died during today's panel due to the conflict. And those are directly conflict attributable deaths. Could be double that. In terms of where we go from here and what's likely to happen in the future, most obviously the best thing to do would be to end the war, but I understand that this is easier said than done. Second, and critical for reducing the indirect deaths is the return of governance to Gaza. So temporary truces, that they don't solve this problem. And the fact that there's not yet an agreement, even in general terms, on who will govern Gaza once the fighting stops is deeply concerning. So the longer that Gaza goes essentially ungoverned, the more and more deadly the situation will become, as a lack of essential services will push an increasing share of Gazans to the brink of survival. Aid and essential services, they must continue to be provided, but they won't solve the problem. They'll save lives on the margins. In the long run, Gazans are going to need to be provided a path towards self-sufficiency rather than isolation and dependency. Otherwise, we can expect that the number of indirect conflict attributable deaths is going to continue to rise in a potentially dramatic fashion, even as the fighting stops today.
That is certainly grim. Rhonda, I wanted you to address what the response has been from the Arab world. We saw the Saudis call a summit of the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Conference, but Arab countries that have signed normalization agreements with Israel, none of them have broken relations. We even see reports that the Saudis still want to join the Abraham Accords when the war ends. Beyond Qatar and Egypt, which are performing very important functions as mediators and getting hostages out and aid in. What is the attitude in the Arab world as they watch this calamity unfold?
First, thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Simpson, for the invitation, and really honored to share the virtual podium with this distinguished panel. Let me talk about 4 common denominators that exist today across the Arab region. The first one is high levels of public anger at the Israeli violence that's meted against Palestinian. People are seeing 24-hour coverage of the carnage unfolding in Gaza on Al Jazeera, Al Hadath, Al Arabiya, Al Mayadeen, everywhere you look. Every Arab TV station is covering what's going on, telling the stories of the Palestinians and what they are suffering. And that's really fueling a lot of public anger and is making positions of government like the UAE and Bahrain, which initially cast the blame on Hamas for starting the violence. It made them moving more and more toward now endorsing permanent ceasefire, partly to balance between a stance that's still supportive of engagement with Israel with public anger at what Israel is doing. The second common denominator is the Arab government across the board, whether it's GCC or whether it's Egypt, Jordan, it's their deep dismay at the blank check President Biden gave to Israel. The no strings policy that the no strings US policy vis-a-vis Israel is somehow, makes them angry, but also it's confusing. They have not seen something like that in terms of US presidents, joining, for example, a war cabinet in Israel, which eventually was seen is seen as basically given, sanctioning the ground campaign, which followed that war cabinet. That even people in the region, experts who have lived through those periods, as well as officials, they said even in 1973, when the US sent this major airlift of supplies to Israel, passed 2.2 billion aid bill, still at the time, Secretary of State Kissinger, the president, were trying to balance, between their support for Israel and, reaching out to Arab states, partly in order to be able to gain credibility and credits with the Arab governments in order eventually to jumpstart a political process, a negotiation process when the time comes and the fighting stops. They see this lack of a nuanced approach by the US president himself and senior officials in his administration as very troubling and as eventually creating trouble down the line for the US to try to play a mediator role in whatever process gets launched, if it gets launched between Israelis and Palestinians. The third common denominator is, again, the realization in the Arab region that you can no longer marginalize the Palestinian issue. There have been attempts by Arab government, but as well by American administration to marginalize the the Palestinian issue. Focus on engagement with Iran, nuclear deal with Iran during the Obama administration, focus on normalization with Israel during the Trump administration, as well as during the Biden administration, and try to basically marginalize the Palestinian issue. October 7 attack and what followed after and what's still unfolding have basically, in a way, reinstated the centrality of the Palestinian issue in both the Arab official and public narrative. So what's happening today, building on what Khalil said, I think it's a reality-changing event, both for the Arab government, but also for Iran and its partners and proxy network in the Middle East. And I think Ali will be talking about that, when in discussing that. And finally, what we are seeing is that in the beginning of this, we have seen Arab governments straddling a spectrum of position in terms of who is to be blamed for this. You have Egypt, Jordan, Qatar, Kuwait to some extent, basically trying to contextualize the October 7 violence in a historical, in the historical background of Israeli occupation, of marginal abandonment of the peace process by the international community, of divide and rule vis-a-vis the Palestinian leadership by Israel, strengthening the role of Hamas in Gaza. So they try to, in a way, contextualize this and lay the blame, especially Qatar, on Israel and Israeli policies. And then you have, on the other end of the spectrum, you have countries like the UAE and Bahrain, who basically said, well, this is Hamas violence, Hamas, and this is where the blame should be. However, now we are seeing everybody moving toward somehow a consensus position, realignment around the need for a permanent ceasefire and conflict de-escalation. And that's what happened in the ministerial committee, in the emergency meeting of the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Conference that was convened in Riyadh on November 11. There was the point of contention about relations with Israel, where you have basically GCC countries, especially those that have signed the Abraham Accords, but also including Saudi Arabia, refusing to heed the demand by what's called the radical camp in the Arab group, Syria, Algeria, Lebanon, to cut off relations with Israel, to move away from peace treaties, that they have signed with Israel. Even Saudi Arabia did not join the call. So the default position was to create this ministerial committee from both the Organization of Islamic Conference and the Arab League, and it's now in New York. It's coming to DC. Basically, it's to create.
It went to China, as I recall. It went to Beijing. Yeah.
Sense of action, right? To create a sense of action. I think the most interesting case here in this in Arab government stance, in my opinion, is Saudi Arabia. You know, Saudi Arabia, we all expected, given what was going on pre-October 7 in terms of normalization, we expected Saudi Arabia to be more nuanced in a way, not nuanced, but to be less hard line on Israel as it has been, you know, to be and so going forward, I think on the issue of normalization that you have raised, Barbara, I think normalization is not off the table. However, I think there will be two factors for Saudi Arabia going forward. One is they have to wait for a long time until pro-Palestinian public sentiment, including in Saudi Arabia, you know, goes down a little bit. Right now, it's very high, and they're not going to do anything in terms of deal with Israel. And second, until, you know, the war ends, they see what is the end state in Gaza. But then the price for the deal, as far as concessions by Israel to the Palestinian, has gone up quite a bit because of October 7. And so I think the other interesting part is that I think the taunt that we have seen at the beginning of this year, you know, between Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and Iran, I think it's going to continue. And again, interesting that Saudi Arabia did not join the UAE and Bahrain in laying the blame on Hamas, but rather more was in the camp of Iran in pushing for a permanent ceasefire, and most importantly, not using the Hamas action to mobilize public opinion against the Iranian regime. We are not seeing that happening in the Arab region, you know, and that's interesting. One last point: the countries that have basically are part of the resistance axis, particularly let me talk about Iraq and Lebanon. I think the decision by sub-state actors, non-state actors in these two countries, you know, to join the war, even in a limited fashion, despite or, you know, without any kind of sanctioning, official approval by the governments, I think shows again the hollowness of state institution in these countries and the challenges of that state fragility in these countries pose.
That is very comprehensive, and I appreciate it very much. We'll turn now to Ali. Ali, Iran seems to be trying to have it both ways. It is scoring propaganda gains from the Hamas attacks on Israel, but it doesn't seem to want to provoke a wider war, particularly one that would jeopardize Hezbollah, its crown jewel. One other interesting point, have a piece that came in from a writer for our blog, Middle East Voices, noting that in the summit in Riyadh, Ibrahim Raisi, who was on his first visit of an Iranian president to Saudi Arabia in more than a decade, signed on to a final communique which actually supported a two-state solution, which is not something that Iran has done in the past. Now, Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, gave a blistering speech today to, I believe, the IRGC, in which he reiterated Iran's call for a referendum of all Palestinians everywhere, which would decide the fate of Israel, Palestine. So pulling Raisi back, but it still is interesting that Raisi was able to sign on to a communique that called for a two-state solution. So give us your best sense of what Iran is up to as it sees this crisis unfold.
Barbara, I apologize. I think I lost your audio. I don't know if you can hear me, but I lost your audio. So I didn't hear the question. After this round, I will try to connect with my phone, but I have a good guess what you asked. So let me start by first thanking you and also saying I'm really honored to be on the panel with Mayrav, Randa, Khalil, and Colin. And say that so far, I think the war has been a mixed bag for Iran. There are some positive elements from an Iranian perspective and some negative elements. I think in the category of success, the October 7th, the horrible Hamas attack, basically has broken the aura of invincibility of Israel. And that's a positive from the perspective the receiving end of Israeli actions against Iran, whether it was covert against Iranian nuclear facilities or against Iranian military facilities or personnel, and whether it was overt against Iranian assets in Syria. It has also inflicted tremendous damage on Israel's reputation, on the US's reputation in the region, on the West's reputation writ large. I'm now in Berlin, and you should just listen to European officials of how they believe that the relationship with the entire region has changed for a very long time. A lot of regional countries, Arab states, telling them that they can never again bring up issues of human rights with them, given the double standards and hypocrisy that has been put on display over the past few weeks. I think also in the category of success for the Iranians is the fact that the Palestinian cause, as Randa mentioned, has been revived in ways that it was really hard to imagine just a few months ago. And for Iran, that claims to be the flag bearer of that cause that transcends its inherent limitations in terms of a Shia Persian nation in the region, again, that is a positive. It has also, I don't think derailed, but delayed for sure, normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and that too is a positive. And finally, I think deterrence has helped in the sense that both the US and Israel had to think twice about what they were doing so that the conflict doesn't escalate. But the flip side of this coin is that there's also negatives for Iran, and the key is the opposite of what I just said. The credibility of Iran's deterrence has been diminished. And this is for several reasons. First, the red line of no ground incursion, Israeli ground incursion into Gaza turned out to be a pink one very quickly. Second, it was put on full display for the world to see that both Iran and Hezbollah were very reluctant to enter into the fray. And so, yes, they have capabilities, but they're very reluctant to use those capabilities for anything that is less than a defense of their own homeland. Third, in terms of diminishing the credibility of deterrence, is the fact that one of the Axis members, Hamas in this case, is going to be significantly diminished, not destroyed, but significantly diminished, and that again diminishes the deterrence. And finally, Iran's strategy was to be able to create 4 simultaneous fronts against Israel, from Lebanon, from Gaza, from West Bank, and from the Golan Heights. The latter two were not yet at the point of development, and I think this is why Hamas's action probably was perceived by the Iranians as premature. The second failure of all of this for Iran is the fact that the door to diplomacy between Iran and the US, I think as a result of what happened on October 7, has now been shut for the foreseeable future. It's hard to imagine that what we had just a few weeks ago, which was not just a detainee deal and a de-escalatory understanding, but plans to start negotiations about what comes next on the nuclear front in Oman are now completely off the table. And there is no light at the end of the tunnel for the Iranians to be able to get any economic reprieve as a result of that diplomacy between now and November of next year. So it is really a mixed picture for the Iranians. But the key point here is that at the end of the day, as long as Israel, through disproportionate response, ends up creating more enemies than it is actually killing, Iran would be able to benefit from that situation.
Thank you. Can you hear me now, or are you going to sign back on? You can't hear me. Okay. Well, I'm going to proceed to some follow-ups. The questions are already piling in, I have to say, for everyone. Let me ask you, well, I want to talk about how the war ends and what, if anything, is going to come on a political horizon. But there is one question here. It's anonymous, but I think you should address it. And this is, what did the world expect? Did the world expect Israel not to respond when Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th? What did the world expect Israel to do when Hamas is using its people as human shields and hidden civilian infrastructure? I feel sorry for the civilian casualties, but I still think Israel has a right to self-defense, and Hamas as a terrorist organization should be eliminated. Israel should allow a two-state solution to take place. Both sides should learn how to live as neighbors and children of one God. So this is a question and a comment from one of our attendees. You spoke about the trauma. You spoke about the mood in Israel now, and so given that, yes, people hate Bibi. They would like to see him go. They blame him and so on. But given this intense mood, this feeling of humiliation, of anger, also at what Hamas was able to do on October 7th, how do you move from that to a political horizon? I mean, the only hopeful things I have seen or heard in the last however many weeks have come from, I have to say, Jewish and Arab Israelis within the country who have talked about trying to build something together that would outflank the extremists on the right. Do you see any prospects for that? And how long do you think this war is going to go on?
So before I kind of dig into that, I just kind of want to give an overview of how I read the situation. I mean, and sort of addressing this question as well from the anonymous, but I mean, the reason that we got to where we got today is not just because Israeli policies have not been effective at securing Israel, but because Israel really, I mean, we've heard it many times since October 7th, but Israel thought that the Palestinian issue was a non-issue. And that's not, it's a result of a dehumanization of Palestinians, but it's also a result of which hurts Israel's own interest of what I like to call a politicide, which is something that Baruch Kimmerling, an Israeli scholar, had coined around the time that Sharon was PM. Basically just the complete demolition of any kind of Palestinian political identity or existence. And that's something that has been true in Israeli politics forever, with maybe a few brief pauses under Rabin. And what we see today is the result of that, of not being able to engage with them on the minimum aspect of not just not giving them political rights, but not even engaging with them in any kind of political framework. Now, Israel, of course, claims there's no Palestinian partner, but that doesn't address the fact that Israel, has to figure out a way to live with these people, and it cannot continue to simply act with impunity. And that's also on the US and other actors that have allowed it to. So this kind of arrogance and hubris and notion that it just never would have to deal with it was clearly shattered. And so the Israeli public is not able yet, I think, to formulate and to, it does criticize and realize that whatever was happening until now didn't work. But unfortunately, its response to that is to dig in further with military might. And I think Israelis are maybe starting to. I mean, some of the victims of the South speak about, and some of them are very famous peace activists, they speak about the fact that there's no way to do this militarily. But I think the majority of the Israeli public, and certainly the leadership, are in the exact opposite position. And you have to understand also that Israel has a fully annexationist Greater Israel policy, very explicit in this government. And the Hamas attack has only given it more legitimacy for it to accelerate that. And that's happening in Gaza and in the West Bank. What you're seeing in Gaza is essentially a depopulation and moving them into smaller and smaller spaces, potentially creating a refugee crisis on Egypt's border as well. Not to mention a humanitarian crisis that the world, if this continues, is going to have to address. It's not going to be able to not address it. And then Israel gets de facto what it isn't able to get diplomatically, which is essentially what Rabin once said was, we wish Gaza could just fall out into the sea or fall off the map. And so it's very, very dangerous, because now it seems to have increased legitimacy to do the things that it was already doing before October 7th. So the first thing that's clear is that Israel needs a new leadership, and that could take quite a long time. There's nobody who could, even if Netanyahu resigned tomorrow, there's nobody that would come in and take his place. But I think also on a deeper level, and as with my hat at, as crisis group, it's Israel and Hamas have been negotiating right now indirectly for days, and Israel has had to make concessions because of the attack and because of the fact that force was used And so we see that there are ways in which Israel is forced to negotiate and to make concessions, and that should be the basis of something bigger. And I think you can look at Israeli history and see that the military solutions have not worked. And it's true that in wars, people are killed, and sometimes wars and horrible things are what actually creates opportunities. But in this case, I don't think that's the case. And so to answer your question about how long this war could go on, I think because of the way that we know that Israel in the past occupied Gaza, and until now, I would say occupied it from the outside since it withdrew in 2005, and because we've seen what happened in Lebanon when Israel also went in and ended up occupying it for almost 2 decades, it's very possible that Israel will now be in a de facto occupation of Gaza, or at least the north of Gaza, for quite a while. And we'll see in Gaza what we've seen in the West Bank, which is that Israel goes in and does operations, whether ground or from the air, when it needs to. It does it in Syria as well. And so that could be a long drawn out process that is, significantly worse for the population than it already was under the siege. And I just don't see Israel being able to kind of create this victory narrative anytime soon. And I hope the world will not stand by while things deteriorate even further. So I'll stop there.
I guess it's kind of a similar question to you, Khalil. I mean, clearly, Hamas has disqualified itself from being considered a partner in many ways because of the atrocities of October 7th. The Israelis have made it very clear that even if they're negotiating with Hamas indirectly to get hostages out, they do not see Hamas as being able to govern Gaza going forward. And we have in the PA, we've spoken about this. It's corrupt. It's led by an 88-year-old man who, has been in power since 2005 on a supposedly 4-year term. Clearly, the Palestinian cause needs new leadership. So where can that come from? Does it exist within the boundaries of Palestine writ large? Does it exist in the diaspora? How can those who care about peace begin to try to encourage the emergence of new Palestinian voices? And is there some sort of prospect within the Israeli Arab community as well? I have this fantasy that somehow the Arab parties in Israel and the center left can coalesce, as they did actually before Bibi came back into power, and form a government that might be more amenable to some sort of diplomatic resolution of this crisis.
Lots of questions, Barbara. Very good.
Always.
We should be finished by noon.
Yeah.
Look, let me start with the last one in the sense that it's the shortest. I do not expect anything creative or constructive at this time from the Arab-Israeli community. As you know, this is my own community. I stay in touch with it directly on a daily basis for different reasons. One is the parties are in shambles right now. The Arab parties, they're on the defensive. Number two, most people in this country have underestimated the impact of this war on the Arabs of 48, on the Arabs inside Israel. They're under siege. Biden keeps bragging about preventing other fronts from emerging. He might have delayed, I would say, not necessarily prevented Hezbollah from getting into this fight. It is partially involved, whether we like it or not. But in terms of the Arabs in Israel, it's really the third front right now. It's open. It's not military, but it's political. The siege under which Arab citizens of Israel find themselves today is unprecedented since 1948. Not any other war before put them on the defensive like this one. The hatred, the racism, the discrimination, the arrests, the firing of academics, of doctors in hospitals who treat patients from both sides. Israel is in La La Land right now domestically, and I fully agree with Mera in her description of the internal unsettled situation in Israel. With regard to Anonymous, good questions. Of course, disagree with your premises totally. Israel, of course, as a state, it's a recognized sovereign state. It does have the right to defend itself, but no country can have its cake and eat it too. You cannot be an occupying power and claim the right to defend yourself. That's why I put this the discussion in context earlier on in my remarks. This is not about today. This is not about October 7th. There is a whole long history before that. So you cannot occupy another people and oppress them and deprive them of their self-determination and other basic rights. And when they hit back, you come back and whine to me about your right to to defend yourself. This is a war of vengeance, not a war of self-defense. And what, 1 to 10, 1 to 100? How many do you want to kill in order you to satisfy your biblical dimension of revenge? It doesn't work today. In the days of Joshua, maybe, but not today. It doesn't work. And it creates more enemies than it eliminates. Anger and anxiety, of course there is anger and anxiety on the part of so many Israelis, but how about the anger and anxiety not in 5 weeks, anger and anxiety over 75 years of oppression and occupation? One has to be fair and even-handed in one's analysis. Questions are all open and all legitimate, but one has to be fair in order to understand the problem.
Yeah. Colin, the question of rebuilding Gaza does seem awfully far in the future right now, but what do you anticipate can be done in the short term to alleviate the situation? Will hospital ships off the coast, tents brought in by UNHCR, I mean, UNRWA, what can be done? And we should say a word here about the more than 100 UN workers who've been killed in their efforts to try to alleviate the situation in Gaza. What would you advise the United States, Arab countries to do in the short term to try to alleviate the crisis over this winter?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I mean, as far as I understand it, more than 50% of infrastructure has been destroyed, right? And so that's going to take years to rebuild. There are some proposals to build more temporary hospitals, field hospitals, perhaps, but that then robs resources from making a permanent solution, right? So I think if I could make a recommendation, it would be the bombing of hospitals has to stop. Even if there is a question of potentially its misuse, their misuse by Hamas. In war, you have a responsibility to protect civilians, and you have to go above and beyond to protect civilians. And sometimes that means taking on additional risk for your own forces. But I think rebuilding hospitals has to be the top priority. If not, you can't treat simple cases of diarrhea, right? You can't treat respiratory infections, and so. I was thinking last night I got a paper cut on my finger, right? It's silly. I go to the bathroom and I put a Band-Aid on and I'm fine, right? If you get a paper cut and you're living outside and you have no clean water, you have nothing, that could get infected. And now that this minor thing that we think is trivial here sitting in our offices becomes deadly, it can become deadly. And so I think healthcare is absolutely the first thing. Permanent hospitals, not temporary hospitals, I think if possible. I know that would be a tall order prior to the winter getting more severe, but beyond that, it's got to be electricity, internet connectivity are things that the internet sounds silly, but that's how you coordinate these days. That's how you coordinate care and governance and things. So those would be my recommendations. All
right. Rhonda, we talked a little bit about what Arab countries can do. You talked about how the price for Saudi-Israeli normalization has gone up enormously after this, but are we seeing any kind of effort at leadership on the Arab side? And I have a specific question for you from an old friend of both of us, Tom Lippman, who asks whether the war has sanitized the al-Sisi regime in Egypt. I think that is an interesting question, so let me send those your way. You have to unmute. Yeah.
I don't see yet coordination among Arab countries in terms of thinking of the day after. I mean, it's basically thinking of the day off. I mean, Egypt, Qatar are focusing on mediation.
Yeah.
The others, UAE, Saudi Arabia, are pushing for Egypt, Jordan, pushing for ceasefire, working on that, seeing that. But I don't see them thinking and working on the day after, to be very honest. And I think that's a problem. They are not even coordinating their activities today. Maybe Egypt and Qatar are, but the rest are not coordinating with Egypt and Qatar. So the whole is definitely not greater than the sum of its parts. And so that's, in my opinion, that's a missed opportunity. Now, going forward, at least 4 countries will have great leverage in whatever political process will emerge in the post-conflict phase, because they are the ones that are going to be called upon by the international community, including the US, to put the money to rebuild Gaza. I don't see any US Congress now in the future approving a single penny, to go into the reconstruction of Gaza and the rebuilding of Gaza. So the responsibility is going to fall on Qatar, on Saudi Arabia, on UAE, and on Kuwait to come in and put money. And these countries have already said that any kind of assistance in the future is going to be conditioned on that being part of a political process that create a serious pathway toward an independent Palestinian state. And that's a leverage. That's in addition to this carrot that Saudi Arabia has in terms of normalization with Israel. I think that's another source of leverage for Saudi Arabia in the negotiation going forward. It can put it on the table. The same also for normalization for Qatar, for example. They can, although you have a de facto normalization today, you have Israeli officials, head of the Mossad in Qatar meeting, with his counterpart from Egypt, from the United States, from Qatar. So, I mean, you have the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs in Israel, so of Qatar in Israel. So you have a de facto normalization between Qatar and Israel, but that also could be put on the table going forward. I think the problem is that nobody seems to know how this is going to end. What's the end state of this? How long this is going to take, and how bad it's going to be, by the time this is over. Let me push back on the issue of Hamas as being out of a political process, if I can. Sure. Whether we like it or not, today Hamas is the voice of the Palestinian people. You like it or not, this is where we are. We are where we are. And going forward, when you think about a Palestinian negotiating side or Palestinian negotiation delegation, Hamas in some form has to be represented. Its political leadership has to be represented because it's seen by a large segment of the Palestinian people as representing their aspiration, as representing their needs. The other problem, I think, going forward is going to be this resistance narrative versus the negotiation narrative. And if there is one loser of the Hamas attack, in my opinion, is the diplomatic negotiation narrative, which is the pathway that the PA has, pursued over the years versus the pathway that Hamas has pursued. Yes, there are now indirect negotiations between Israel and Hamas. But how did that happen? How did that come about? It came about as a result of a violent attack that led to the kidnapping of 240 Israeli hostages, bringing them, I hate to say, as a bargaining chip in this negotiation. So in fact, the resistance narrative, in a way, in my opinion, has gained more currency than, for example, the diplomatic narrative, at least in the short term. In the long term, they will, When it comes to the sanitizing the LCC government, definitely, I think he's going to win the elections in December.
Yeah.
It's nothing like a fight that will rally people around the flag, and he's going to win it despite all the problems that Egyptians feel. And we are seeing more and more with him playing the mediator role on the hostage release. I think it's again making his regime even more relevant, more needed in charting a future pathway here. And we are seeing the EU now coming to Egypt, basically, offering all kinds of financial assistance to help with the migration issue. However, there is definitely a threat, and Myrav has referred to that. There is definitely a threat to Egypt national security that will come from the scenario of millions of Gazans from South Gaza, from North Gaza, coming to the border, to the Rafah border, basically. And then you are going to see an Egyptian public reaction that's going to call on the Egyptian government to open the border, to let these people in. And I think that will create a very interesting dynamic going forward. Right now, they can close it, but if you have this, people are going to say in Egypt, we are going to see demonstrations saying, we cannot let them die. We cannot let them. And so there will be pressure on the government going forward to let them in. And then we are talking about a whole form of displacement taking place of Gazans.
Well, that obviously is Israel's preferred solution, that millions of Gazans move into Egypt. I wanted to ask you one other question that popped up that's very Lebanon focused, if I may, Rhonda. This is a question about whether it's possible to foresee an update or implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1701 in Lebanon. I'm not sure what that is exactly, but perhaps you know.
I don't know. I mean, there is, I think it has to do with the role of the Lebanese army, in terms of
on the border, yeah.
On the border with Israel. There will be definitely a push, in Congress in the future, especially from not only the the anti-Hezbollah quarter, which is quite large in Congress, but also from congressmen who are seen as friends of Lebanon, in terms of the inability of the Lebanese government, the unwillingness of Lebanese officials, not Hezbollah, but everybody else in the Lebanese spectrum, basically not to live up to their responsibilities according to 1701 and letting, Hezbollah basically make this decision of engaging in the war, although again, in a limited fashion, without any kind of pushback from any side in the country, not from the caretaker cabinet, not from Christian parties, some of them have, but nothing significant. Granted, the Palestinian issues transcend denominational divisions in the country. Granted, you have seen more of a rallying from Sunni communities, from Druze communities around, the Palestinians, but still, I mean, there at least needed to have discussion of this decision to engage in this war in the Lebanese cabinet, which in fact did not happen. So you're going to have a pushback, for example, on the issue of assistance to the Lebanese armed forces that the United States has been given, on the idea that, according to 1701, they are also a force that can contest the space with Hezbollah going forward. I think that you are going to see a pushback from that in this country, and that's going to be reflected again in the debate inside the country.
Question, actually, let me go back to Halil and also Myrav. This is again about Palestinian leadership. There's a question about whether it's completely unrealistic to assume that Marwan Barghouti, who is serving 5 life sentences in Israeli prison, would one day be released. And, I've heard him spoken of as the Palestinian Mandela and so on. And if there are any other names of Palestinians in Israeli jails, in the West Bank, that might be put forward as potential leaders. Obviously, even Mahmoud Abbas cannot live forever. And also, Halil, if you could address, and Myrav as well, the notion of whether Hamas can somehow be brought into, a new and renewed Palestinian leadership that could actually negotiate with the Israelis. Maybe you start, Halil.
Okay, with regards to the last part of the question, the answer is yes. I think as a political force representing, I don't know, right now, probably more than its usual 20% of the Palestinian population, especially on the West Bank right now, the popularity of Hamas is much higher. I would estimate it to be at about 40%. So it probably has a plurality of support. So yes, it has to be at one point involved. Now, the Palestinians can make that easier for themselves and for the rest of the world by reconciling and bringing Hamas. It's time for them to bring Hamas back into the PLO. It has never been part of the PLO, and the PLO is being dormant. It's time to revive it in a proper way and allow it to resume control over the Palestinian Authority, which now is like an upside down pyramid standing on its head. So it has to go back to its original form. But the answer is yes, you can't have credibility. Number two, suggesting, everybody has a suggested leader for the Palestinians. With all due respect, those of us who come from democratic countries and pretend to be Democrats, it's time for us to act that way. Let the Palestinians choose their own leaders. We cannot dictate to the Palestinians. After all, they are a very political people. They've been struggling for 75 years. Everybody talks about their right to self-determination. Guess what? Self-determination includes the right not only to vote your future or what form of government, but the type of leaders you want. So with all due respect to Barghouti or any other, I mean, I could name 100 people that are qualified to do that, but we have to let them up. Now, if I were Abu Mazen, this is what I would do. I would declare today my resignation within 1 year time, in which conditional that the Palestine issue goes back to the UN, asking the UN with the support of superpowers to basically hold elections, free and democratic elections in Palestine, both the West Bank and Gaza. This is the only way, first of all, to impose a Palestinian initiative on the process right now, to take the lead, to preserve the integrity of Palestinian governance, and to give the Palestinian people the right to choose. Let them choose. Of course, there is the risk of the US rejecting the results as it did last time and refusing to accept Hamas as the elected official. But hey, that's as politicians in this country are fond of saying, democracy is not a neat process. Right? So that's what needs to be done. I would say an initiative of this sort might really restore the credibility of a weakened Palestinian Authority at this time, and might be a dignified segue for Mahmoud Abbas to exit the scene down the road if he gives himself a time schedule and a deadline to leave the scene with his own dignity intact. And yet at the same time create a creative process for the Palestinians to pursue, supported by the international community in the name of democracy and self-determination.
That's a very interesting suggestion. Merav, any possibility that someone like Barghouti could be freed as part of this prisoner exchange that's going on?
I mean, that's something that's been, talked about and raised at different points in time for many, many years. I mean, I really, I don't think that's the issue here. And I think that would be, once again, Israel engineering Palestinian leadership, which is, of course, problematic. And just on the issue with Hamas, I'll just say that in some ways, I think Hamas's strategy, partly in doing this attack, was that it doesn't want to hold the governing authority in Gaza anymore, that it wants to go back to its, armed resistance. And that's something that it wants to be part of the PLO, but I don't think it wants to be the one who deals with the daily situation in Gaza. And from the Israeli perspective, I'll just say that Israel, once did not recognize the PLO. The PLO was also considered a terror group, and so you have these phases, these things.
I remember it well when
we have seen this film before. Huh? We've seen this.
Yeah. Now, Israel's positioning right now is not like, sure, get Hamas in there and we'll put them into the PLO and everything will be fine. That's not what's happening here. But if Israel wants to be strategic and not just strong, then it does need to think about these other options.
Let me go to some more of the questions. Let's see. Not sure who this would be for. This is from Tom Kalina. Will Hamas release all hostages if that removes their leverage on continuing the pause or the ceasefire? What might Hamas demand in exchange for the last of the hostages? Does anybody have any insight into?
I can answer that.
Yeah, okay, Marie, and then Halil.
Well, just I think it's what the emerging kind of offer on the table is that it is holding out on the last of the hostages, the soldiers, in exchange for a stop to the war. I mean, that seems to be what's on the table. So I don't think it's that much of a mystery.
Yeah. Do you agree, Khalil?
I do agree, but Hamas essentially, look, it is an armed movement, and people object to that and classify Hamas as a terrorist organization in several countries around the world. But Hamas also is a political movement. Hamas wants to rule, like it or not. Hamas wants to replace Fatah as the party that is in charge of Palestine. And unless they have that option, they will continue to resort to they have the olive branch in the left hand, if you will, and the gun in the other hand. And it's up to those who are concerned about the future of this region to do so. Now, don't forget that it's Netanyahu, this current government in Israel, that strengthened Hamas over the past 15 years. And talking about what Mirav said, I love the term she used, engineering leaders for the Palestinians. Don't forget that it was Netanyahu that engineered Sinwar. Sinwar did not come out of vacuum.
Came out of Israeli prison.
Exactly. So talking about Barghouti and Sinwar and so on. So again, it's an old story. We've seen it before, and it failed before. So I'm not sure that is the answer at this time. But Hamas is a legitimate political party, whether one agrees or disagrees with its right to bear arms and what it does with that. And it has repeated, even during this crisis, its political intentions. And if people take it seriously, that might tip the balance internally within Hamas in favor of basically reforming itself in this new challenging age. Okay, October 7 is changing the whole game. It is, I think Randa said, it is a game, it's a game-changing event for the Arabs. It's a game-changing event for the Palestinians. If we want them to change, this is the time to do it, and this is the way to do it.
Yeah. I'm going to throw this to Merav as well, if I may. There were reports, this comes from my old friend Nader Shamlu, reports that that some of the 1,200 Israelis who were killed on October 7th were actually the victim of Israeli forces. There were some reports about helicopter gunships and so on. I just wonder if you have any insight into whether any of that is true, or whether that is something that has been brought up by those who want to diminish Hamas's responsibility for what happened.
Yeah, I think it's mostly the latter. There was a Haaretz report. I mean, there's still a lot of stuff that is going to be unveiled and discovered about what happened actually that day. But in the mayhem, there was apparently, possible friendly fire, which is something that is not, rare. But, the notion that most or even, more than maybe a couple of people were killed that way, I think is part of the denialism of the scope of the attack. And so I wouldn't really, give it much attention.
Okay, let me find some questions for our other panelists.
I see Ali has a lot.
Yes, Ali has a lot. Let me throw this one to you, Colin. Colin, are the UN and its subsidiaries still functional, and to what extent does their humanitarian work continue to be at risk?
Yeah, I mean, their humanitarian work will continue to be at risk until the war ends. But in terms of how are they functioning, the UNRWA shelters are still functioning, but barely. So there's reports that most of them are overflowing. So people are staying in community centers, gyms, and things like that, schools. So I think the UN is doing the best that it can. And since this temporary truce began, aid from UNRWA, the World Health Organization, and such has been flowing in. So that is, they are functioning right now. But I know that the World Health Organization, in particular, has a policy that if they don't have a secure, safe evacuation plan for their workers, they won't operate. And so if the conflict begins again, that means they stop, right? So they will stop. The UN will continue to do what it can, but as you mentioned, having already lost, having 100 dead so far, they're going to curtail their operations to try to make their people as safe as possible. So our international organizations functioning? Yes, now as the temporary truce, if it holds, they will continue to function. But if the fighting continues, I'm afraid I think most of that work will cease, except for sheltering in place.
Okay, I want to read this comment, I'm sure you've heard this before, Haliel. Your comment from a Dr. Sunny Onyegbula, if that's his name. He says that you're partisan and that you're amazed that he's amazed that you think that an organization that takes hostages could be a legitimate partner for peace. Hamas woke up one day, killed and kidnapped children and other innocent people and took them as hostages. How did this heinous act help the Palestinian cause? They should have attacked the Israeli army. I'm sorry, I disagree with him. So I'm just going to read that in fairness. There's a question also about
Can I respond?
I think you have sufficiently made your view clear that Hamas.
Okay, that's fine. Go ahead.
So we'll leave it
No,
there.
I mean, he's welcome to disagree.
We're running low on time.
All right, no problem.
There's a question about whether today's conversation will be posted online. Absolutely. There are a bunch of questions on for Ali, including what are the prospects that this is all going to lead to war with Iran. There's another one also about Turkey. I've noticed that Erdogan has been absolutely foaming at the mouth about Israel lately and saying quite incendiary things. What is Turkey's role in all of this? And let me throw this one to you also, Ali, and then all to the rest of the panelists as we're getting closer to the end. This is from Carl Inderfirth, very distinguished former U.S. official. Everyone seems to be repeating the two-state mantra, but how feasible is a two-state concept today? A state, to become a state, must have land. Given the continuous expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, where is the land for a viable Palestinian state? So Ali, why don't you do a bunch of them and then we'll do one pass around for everyone's views on one state, two state, what is possible?
Sure. So look, on the risks of escalation between Iran and the U.S., I think, as I said initially, it's pretty clear that neither Iran nor the U.S. want further escalation, but the degree of escalation between them is exactly a function of what happens in Gaza. We saw with the beginning of the conflict in Gaza, the period of lull in tit-for-tats between the U.S. and Shia-backed militias in Iraq and Syria come to an end. We had more than a year in Iraq that there were no attacks on U.S. forces. Since March of this year, there were no attacks on U.S. forces, but all of a sudden, in the course of the past 6 weeks, we had more than 60 attacks in Iraq and Syria against U.S. forces. More than 50 U.S. Military personnel were injured. Now, thankfully, no one was killed, and the U.S. has responded at least 5 times. And now, in the course of the past few days, during the truce, all of that has come to a halt from Iraq and Syria. The Houthis, that's a separate story. I can get back to that, but I think in general, the whole point of this exercise by groups that are supported by Iran, and I use that word carefully because they're not necessarily controlled by Iran. Iran has influence over these groups. There is a degree of coordination between them, but that doesn't mean that every single attack is green-lighted by Iran. But I think the whole point of it was to deter the U.S. from basically giving Israel free rein to do whatever it wants in Gaza, to deter the U.S. from further expanding the conflict. But at the end of the day, there is a significant risk in fine-tuning and calibrating this kind of tit-for-tat. A lot of the rockets and missiles that have been fired at U.S. bases are imprecise. These are not precision.
You're starting to break up a bit. Maybe turn off your video and let's see if that helps.
Can you hear me now?
A little better. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. I think there is the risk that one of these rockets and missiles would accidentally, because again they're not precision guided, would result in the kind of fatalities that would then
result in tensions spiraling out of control. And the Houthis, from the beginning of this, have been a major concern for me because they are fiercely independent. They have a track record of not listening to Iranian advice, and they might do things that again would put everybody in front of a fait accompli. So the risk is there. The longer this goes on, if Israel indeed goes to the south and imagine the number of fatalities and casualties that we've had in the north, that was largely depopulated, not completely, but largely. Now all of that population has been pushed to the south. If Israel goes to the south, probably we would see way more casualties and fatalities, and that is in turn going to create the kind of reaction within the axis that increases the risk of miscalculation or mishap that could be very problematic. And let me just add one more element here to the complexities that we've talked about so far, which is that if indeed Israel manages to significantly diminishes Hamas, and with it the credibility of Iran's regional deterrence, in the process it would make the nuclear deterrent much more attractive for Iran. Yeah. Hamas is not an existential threat to Israel. A nuclear-armed Iran is. And so the more Israel succeeds against Hamas, the more it fails against Iran. And that's a serious consideration to take into account, especially in a situation that there is really no light at the end of the tunnel for a diplomatic settlement of the nuclear crisis with Iran. On Turkey, I don't pretend to be a Turkey expert, but I can just say that I think only countries that can play a significant role in this conflict who have leverage. And I don't see Turkey necessarily having a lot of leverage here. The key actor is really the United States, and the Biden administration has, through its support of Israel, built a lot of credit. The question is whether it is willing to use that credit to get the outcome that it wants. But I'm not holding my breath, because at the end of the day, we are in an election year, and the political space for the Biden administration is quite limited.
Thanks. Let me go to Rhonda on the question of the two-state solution. Is there, in your view, as someone who has followed this region so closely for so many years, who's lived through so many wars and conflicts in it, is there a prospect still of an independent Palestine side by side with an independent Israel, in your view?
Well, I mean, there is no alternative. I don't see an alternative to the two-state solution that is feasible, that is, I hear the argument for the one-state solution, but I don't think it's going to be, it's something that the Palestinians will go for. I think the two-state solution remains the only diplomatic alternative. Whether it's implementable, is there on the grounds, developments on the ground have rendered it non-implementable? I can hear that argument, but also I think there are still the makings there of an independent state in some form. The question is going to be what's happening in the West Bank. I think the settlement activity in the West Bank are going to be a major obstacle to this process going forward. I know that President Biden has threatened to apply sanctions, visa sanctions on settlers groups or those who are engaged in violence by the settlers against, I don't know. Let's see if they act on the threats. Let's see if they impose financial sanctions on these settler groups that many of them have, and leaders, many of whom have, US bank accounts as well as dollar accounts. And so I think West Bank, the settlements, freeze on settlement is going to be a condition, an important prerequisite for any kind of political process going forward that can provide the pathway to an independent Palestinian state. But I agree with Khalil and with Mayrav. The two prerequisites, in my opinion, is a change in the Israeli leadership. I mean, this government has been committed to the prevention of an establishment of a Palestinian state, and a formation of a new leadership on the Palestinian side that can, negotiate and represent the Palestinians.
Yeah.
And I see us far away from that stage.
Colin, I don't know if this is something you want to weigh in on. You've been I've been limiting questions to you about the humanitarian situation, but I would love to have your thoughts on if you were Henry Kissinger come back to life, how would you?
Oh no.
Or I don't know, Jim Baker. Let's make a bet.
Sounds
Jim
better.
Baker come back to life. How would you? He's still alive. Sorry, Jim. And so is Henry Kissinger, for that matter.
They're both still alive.
Both still alive. All right. So if you were both of them combined, how would you? No offense to Tony Blinken. How would you restructure this? What sort of political dialogue would you look for? And do you think it's feasible still, 76 years after UN Resolution 181, to actually fulfill that resolution?
Yeah. I mean, I think from a human rights perspective, I agree with Rhonda. I think a one-state solution would be unacceptable. In recent work that I've completed for the U.S. State Department, my research team built a global data set on mass atrocities in recent years, and this included lethal and less lethal actions such as forced displacement and mass containment. And even prior to the fighting, the conditions in Palestine were worse than anywhere else in the world on a per capita basis, and far and above the worst. So it's my own opinion that the only way to end this is to allow Palestinian self-determination in a separate state from Israel. As far as the diplomatic path forward, I don't know, but I think it's the only way.
Yeah. Any last thoughts from Meirav or Halil on how we go forward? Halil, and then we'll end with Meirav.
Yeah, on the last issue that we just discussed, the two-state solution. The two-state solution, has been dead for a while, diplomatically at least. It's been shelved, not necessarily that it has been proven totally defunct. I agree with Rhonda that there's no alternative if the option is for a peaceful solution to this conflict. But what it takes is some serious, I don't know, lobotomy maybe on the part of some, and serious change in political persuasion on the part of the others. There is nobody more convinced of the two-state solution than Biden. I've heard him, I've heard his staff personally ad nauseum discuss it, but they are not willing to take one practical step in that direction, because either to bury the two-state solution is an expensive process, it's a very expensive funeral, or to revive it requires divine intervention, and maybe these guys do not think they are divinity.
All right, Meirav, we'll give you the last word. As you pointed out, nobody is talking about a political process now, except rhetorically. But obviously there has to be some effort when all of this ends. What do you foresee?
I think the one-state, two-state debate is a detraction from the reality on the ground right now. And I think that the most important thing to keep in mind is that in lieu of a state, Palestinians still deserve to have basic rights. And so at this point, I mean, I can say this and it's not going to happen, but the US and the world needs to force Israel to choose. Either you give everyone equal rights or you withdraw. I mean, and also the settlements, there's not that many settlers. I mean, the settlers have grown, but there's a negative growth rate. They're not moving into the West Bank at these big numbers. Bezalel Smotrich and the rest are hoping and wanting to do that, but Israelis are not moving into settlements. That's not what's happening here. And they can very, very well be moved out of those settlements. So that's not an issue. The issue is the political will primarily of the international stakeholders, and also the change of leadership and a real cost for Israel for its policies, which in 20 years has not been there. So yeah.
Well, I want to thank all of you for your very perceptive remarks. I want to thank our audience. There have been a number of pieces that have been posted in the chat. You will see the links to a number of things that have been written by our panelists. I would also suggest you look at our Middle East Voices blog, which has a number of pieces about the Gaza War and its implications for the region, for various parties in the region. And again, thank you very much for your attention. This is obviously a terrible tragedy that we all hope will come to a resolution very soon. So thank you again for your attention.